Right, hello Danai, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good.
My name is Danai Mupotsa. What would you like to know?
You know what I feel is so important?
Yeah.
If someone was to receive you with an open spirit and an open heart and be open to gaze at you in appreciation of who you are, what you bring, and your signature, what would you want them to know?
I probably would begin, I think I tend to orient myself to my environment, and I think that's maybe why there's many hyphens to what I do, but I don't usually like what I do to be the same as who I am, which is very difficult for people who are academics. I earn my money as a teacher, I work at a university, and I recognize in the last few years how people attach the work they do to their sense of worth and ego. So my work is myself and that layering. So that's not my tendency. My tendency is to read a room because I'm not very good at small talk. So that would be, I don't know how, I'm like, hi, and like, this is my da-da-da-da. I would say, usually if I'm asked, I'm Mika's mom, my daughter. Eunice's daughter, my mom who recently passed. She's very, very, very present. So I think she's the most present aspect of my being at the moment, I think. I think as part of grieving, the space of grieving, which I recognize, grieving a mother is not got a time frame, but I didn't know that before then, yeah.
So would you say, I mean, what you're saying and what I'm hearing, it's interesting because you've made it clear from the beginning that for you, it's about more than the labels that we stick onto each other. The things that we would fill out if it was a census. What is it called? When they do a census.
Yes, the census, yeah.
The census.
Yeah.
Yes, the census. But more than what we would fill out with that. I am interested in what you said about how you feel the presence of your mother who passed away. I want to say Tatenda Nzingha about that. And I want to say, what would you tell someone who is in a space of being present in this reality, but also being very aware about how they are held in other realities and in other dimensions?
I guess I've been trying to figure out a balance of this in terms of what people can hold in this reality. I think a lot of what people attach themselves to can be two ways. So sometimes it's strategic. It allows you to move in the world. And I think sometimes categories of identity show up because they're enabling for us to recognize what we are negotiating in this reality and what things are about you and what things are about the body you're in and how you function and operate in the world. And I also think that those conditions do shape not only how we can make our lives livable, but also that they do shape a consciousness and they become part of the experience of. So not just consciousness like this is how power works, but also consciousness that alerts us to sensing the world. So someone who has to negotiate a lot has many levels of sense making in the world, moving through language, moving through environments, because that's how living operates for them, and may have a heightened consciousness or sensibility. So those, but may also have an identity, like I'm de-institutionalized, which enables me to move strategically as a homeless person. Those things matter in reality, but I think they do raise an awareness that's broader. But I also recognize, particularly around, if I can sense emotion or sense, and having that sometimes people cannot express out loud the range of comfort or discomfort. Functioning often requires to be disaffected. I say to my students often, when I say, I want you to open your senses, your sense of perception, that your perception is not just your, this cortex, this cognitive processing, that they're sensing and that they should take up the potential of all of their senses, but most of our education desensitizes us from the body's knowing, smelling, feeling, so then they have to construct a sense of knowledge that is what I think is understood as, I don't know what you would call it, most of the ways we are taught are not to think. So it's not even the full use of the brain or cognition, but it's also to repeat after me, which probably is why AI will replace most well-educated people in recent time coming. I say you will just broaden your sense of perception. You have more density to work from. You have more options to work from. But that's terrifying if you've been punished for thinking, for thinking in a way that's more expansive, your whole education. So it's too much to ask. Thinking for yourself is too much to ask. And so how does one allow someone to teach themselves, also part of the teaching process, teach themselves to recuperate some of it? I know I've had it recently where I do think a lot, I do narrate a lot, and then having my body have a shaking release, after something like painful or distressing, and I was like, oh, my body's back. So I'm teaching myself, and I think that allowing people to sit within themselves and then begin to perceive the world can do that, but it's where you're at, where I'm at, and then where we meet each other, and then what modes of perception becomes most useful, strategic, prominent, I think, sit with each person.
So I hear you, and I think something that is so interesting that I never got to unpack, and I want to unpack is the idea of deinstitutionalized individuals. Because we value one way of knowing. We value a way of expressing ourselves. And you said the reality of the situation is this rationality that we hold so dear can easily be replicated by AI. So if we speak about ways of knowing and modes of intelligence and what is valuable, what do you think are the potentials for human knowing and human wisdom? And then what is the purpose of our capacity to know?
Well, to know is, I've thought about knowing for a long time, and so being asked to, and I write a lot about feeling, and in scholarly work, but also in other forms, but I didn't recognize that I was distressed by having to feel. So that's something I'm sitting with. But when I use sense making, I think part of it is to move. And I love my brain. Since I've had my brain surgery, I'm like, I'm enamored with my brain. I speak about it in the third person all the time. Most of my body parts. I'd be like, oh, my eyes did not perceive. I often find myself doing that, and I'm curious about what that means. My brain is something I adore. It does amazing things. It can move. So it's not to diminish its capacity, but in fact to expand its capacity. So, or my sense of what its capacity is. In this third person, I keep referring to it so when I say sense, I mean the hair on the skin. So they can feed knowing. Often knowing is built into systems of knowledge. So we can know the world in many ways, but often the idea to contain it within something manageable becomes a practice of knowledge making that can become sensible in the world. And I think it's important to make sense to others. But I think when I say sense making, I mean our modes of perception beyond the kind of prominence of sight as a mode of perception, so touch, the olfactory, the to hear, to feel the beat, and things that we can and cannot perceive in the visible. That way of making sense of the world, of course, involves others, because we make sense of the world with each other, and we can establish common sense by which, and I think consciousness allows common sense. When one recognizes a shared consciousness with another, it allows them to make sense of what's shared in their perception, which is different from a kind of monolingual, monohumanist perspective, where if you and often we have to attach ourselves to that because it's attached to the modes of survival in a anti-black, anti-poor, anti-queer capitalist system that functions precisely on, it's a functioning that is not really perceived as knowing. So for instance, if you are in a job where you are meant to do work that's based around justice, training has taught you that profit is not just good, but profit is as it is, then you can't perceive a different orientation to being an engineer or an accountant because you understand profit as a primary potential category. Mm-hmm. So it means you're constantly fighting against the urge for a just system with a training that has taught you this sense of value that it's not enabling. So I think what that may require in terms of institutional formations, I've been thinking more and more as I work at a university that's increasingly securitized, increasingly neoliberal. It's doing, it feels like increasingly like this up and down. I'm like, this thing has not changed. I say to people when they write an essay, it's terrible, but it'll be good in the future. What evidence do we have? So progression is a strange constituting of time and progress that's attached to this monolingual, monohumanist perspective, right?
That there's so much to look at there.
Mm-hmm.
You've given me so much. One thing that comes through is AI,
mm-hmm.
right? And the idea of approximating Eden.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have people who have the luxury to innovate and recreate our system of rationality,
mm-hmm.
at some point in time, these very intelligences
mm-hmm.
that are being slowed down, that are being said to be non-functional
mm-hmm.
or qualities of someone who's not a good worker,
mm-hmm.
are the very intelligences that will have space to grow and be cultivated,
mm-hmm.
because we will no longer need to perform the basic functions
mm-hmm.
of, understand this input equals output.
Mm-hmm.
So there's potential there,
mm-hmm.
right? Who it benefits, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's as though we are racing towards, what we thought we were racing towards was education, and what it looks like we're racing towards is a collective dumbing down and numbing down
mm-hmm.
of humanity. And yet we also have a new race, can I call it that,
mm-hmm.
of AI, which potentially has non-biological subjectivity,
mm-hmm.
which potentially has its own form of sentience that could emerge over time.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that brings questions of, if we are approximating Eden, is there room to question whether we are moving away from the performance of being
mm-hmm.
to states of actual being?
Yeah, so AI is on my mind mostly because I think because I was on sick leave and then on sabbatical, I was not on a campus for a long time, and I come back and I'm sitting on a TikTok and people are like, oh, the AI this, AI that, and I'm like, oh, it's a filter, I missed 2 years of life apparently, and suddenly there's like this thing in the world that people are terrified of that I thought was in fiction movies. And then I'm at Stellenbosch, and a colleague, an older professor who's about to reach retirement, is talking about ChatGPT now, is it? Mm-hmm. And people have been, I've been hearing this thing, but I'm like, yeah, we have this and this because we now need to learn these new skills. And I thought, oh, this sounds insane. I never thought about it. So it came at a rush to me, and I was thinking about, then I'm more and more watching how quickly this form of intelligence is learning, so to speak. And so I've just started thinking about it as one example. I don't know if I have a sense of, like I said, a progressive sense of time. I think often that notion is an imposition precisely because of its intention of constructing the idea of being human as in relation to others that are within a hierarchy. So whether it's animals, it's forms of nature, it's plants, it's the earth, or it's technology, that there's an assumptive hierarchy. So I often think of the body itself, a lot of what we do to make, to move, that we're simultaneously machinic but also animal, and it's not an and or but, it's a continuity, a set of continuities. So let's say, as I'm situated, my phone or a filter or my lipstick or washing or being water are all extensions of the body itself and what its capacity is to do. And then from that sense making, I can have a more expansive ability to make sense. But if I recognize my relation to these others as a set of relations that are not about my individual or individuated self in a hierarchy, then it means that maybe my ability to engage in relation with is not based on the premise of power over or to reproduce a hierarchy of a particular species of human, although we live in a world that does function in that way. So I'm saying sometimes to function, one has to fight to be included as human. I'm going to fight to be included within human rights discourse because as a queer person, I want to have certain rights to make life possible for me. Mm-hmm. So I said when I talk about strategic, entry into like the consciousness of power over and a way to move against and with power. At the same time, my sense making, that's one language I can speak. I can have multiple languages of being oriented in the world that I code switch through, and people who code switch or have to code switch often are those situated, again, in multiple relation to institutional processes that we're in and out of all the time. People who don't have to ever code switch, who are most monolingual, often then don't have to build that capacity to, you just move in a straight line. And that person may have a more difficult time as this planet refuses to keep going as it's going. You're going to have a harder time picking shit up, mm-hmm. right? Because you haven't had to do it. Whereas someone who's moved between space and time continuously in the day-to-day probably has an easier time adjusting because they're constantly having to adjust and switch anyway. Their capacity already has grown.
Do you know what's interesting? Mm-hmm. So the Kemetic sciences, mm-hmm. the Black sciences, mm-hmm. and the Kabbalah have a very interesting and similarly interesting tree of life. Mm-hmm. In the Kemetic sciences, the upper realm is Osar, mm-hmm. Sekert, mm-hmm. Tehuti, mm-hmm. right? And in the Kabbalah, it's Kether, mm-hmm. which is parallel to Osar, mm-hmm. Hokmah, mm-hmm. which is parallel to Tehuti, mm-hmm. and Bina, mm-hmm. which is parallel to Sekert. Mm-hmm. And to use the Kabbalah to explain this, Bina is that which is the limitation, mm-hmm. or Saturn, mm-hmm. that you embody. You come in and you embody it in this world. Mm-hmm. So that could be being someone who has an experience of economic injustice, residential insecurity, sexual violence, mm-hmm. mental health issues, mm-hmm. or have an identity that is considered marginalized, mm-hmm. right? But the potentiality of that is in knowing that these restrictions, in a way, also offer opportunities for freedom, mm-hmm. right? And this is through the operation of Hokmah, mm-hmm. Tehuti, mm-hmm. right? Which is a wisdom that transcends the conditioned education that we have. Mm-hmm. And also through a capacity to embody, yeah. which is Kether or Sor, mm-hmm. right? And for me, it makes me wonder what your experience has been, because it's so profound for me to hear you say you came to incarnate, you're here to learn the lessons of this reality, mm-hmm. and yet at the same time you negotiate issues of why do we choose certain injustices in our lives, mm-hmm. right? Especially because we're coming to live. Mm-hmm. And the Kemetic science's answer to that would be so that you realize that you are Osam, mm-hmm. so that you realize that you are a human being, mm-hmm. right? And there's innate divinity to you. Mm-hmm. I want to unpack in the context of that, what moment did you have where you were taken out of your beingness, mm-hmm. of being Danai, mm-hmm. into performing Danai, mm-hmm. and having identities ascribed to this embodiment?
Yeah.
And how did that affect your self-sense, which is who you know you are, mm-hmm. as opposed to your self-esteem, mm-hmm. which is who you feel you are?
Yeah. Well, I think the self-esteem, to go first to, I think is the really difficult part, which I think when I was talking about where our sense of validation comes from, it's so critical to how perception works and whatever the hell this is, I mean, it can sound like lunacy to be like, well, I love myself on the inside and I'm going to be fine and I operate in the world. And you can love yourself on the inside all you need, but you also need to be constantly negotiating function in certain ways. I think there's a very large part of me that's, I'm like, that makes so much, what you said, this framing, it makes so much sense of what I was expressing to my child. But I also understand that it can't do the work it takes for me to sense this world and survive it completely. And I'm trying to move past when something, something distressing comes and then I want to fix it. This is my mode. And so, which is maybe different than action, which I recognize as you're speaking, i.e. that sometimes to fix things when I have not, giving the previous example also I gave where people are like, this is my mode of action, and you go to action, you go to this fixing that you've established one language for, and you want to repeat it despite that there's very little evidence of it's working. Because that urge comes in so immediately that you're like, well, let me fix. So now what does it mean to, there have been moments when I've had conflicts, and I think this is ongoing my whole life. So where do I understand this? From quite young, intuitively, when I feel something in my stomach, I didn't always go to action, but I always was like, something just doesn't make sense in terms of what I'm being asked to do here. And yet I could make sense of, so let's say I give an example of when I married and I can see, so the women are like, go to the kitchen and do the cooking. I'm like, okay. But I recognize my positioning as class-wise more privileged person. If I say I'm not going to go peel those, someone's like, peel tomato. Like, it's, first of all, I'm like, you're asking me to do something nonsensical to me, i.e. you are giving me a dual gender system that is a division of space and labor and power that I must now cooperate in and re-establish across generations that I don't quite agree with. And yet I recognize my non-participation puts me in a relation to other women that is complicated because I can opt not to do this as part of my daily function and still survive. And that may not be possible for those others. So I'm going to sit and do this until I had enough time of sweeping the dust floor. I'm like, this is now illogical. I cannot play act domesticity for your pleasure, joy. The kink finished a few minutes ago, it's finished now. But I participate because it allows me a particular mode of recognition that is also a de-establishing of practices, i.e. when we build one mode of feminist consciousness, why do we have this division of space and labor of our bodies that looks like this? But two, I can de-establish that in relation to the context I'm in, i.e. I'm moving my political language, depending on, and I'm allowing my consciousness to be shaped by my interaction in that present moment, so it's not one line of thought. And I also can recognize, because I'm peeling tomatoes and I'm not quite sure why that's happening, that there are many other things, languages, I'm also learning in that space.
Embodying those expectations can be. But what you have raised is how when we perform relationship or we perform I'm in a relationship, we sometimes disembody ourselves and we really dissociate from our own beingness in doing that. And it makes me wonder where and how in different stages of our lives have we managed to approximate love. You get what I mean? Like, I've had experiences of being in queer circles. I've also had experiences of being in heteronormative circles, and my preference is for heteronormativity. And yet in heteronormativity, I found myself performing the exact same role that I performed in queer circles, which was a hybrid of, I think I would call it caretaker provider, right? And that was, it's not so much to whether it was queer or heteronormative, but it was my own internalization of dysfunction, right? It was caretaker provider is self-abandonment for me. And it made no difference whether it was queer or it was heteronormative, because I could have stripped my partner's genders, their races, their ethnicities, and I was still dating the same issue to to unmask something in me.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, one, have you had that experience without going into detail of your personal life? And secondly, what does that mean about our capacity for love?
Yeah.
You know, and especially when we start performing, when we hit the label in a relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we're always in a relation to another person. I think so that has to be a foundational understanding. One doesn't just sit alone in relation to the air, to a plant. You're always in relation. I think that, for me, has become a central sitting point. I'm in relation to this bed I can't get up from. I'm in relation to this floor I'm lying on, having a bit of a moment to breathe. Because it's a grounding that situates me differently than, like, two is one, doing the most. And yet I love that when there's a deep connection with someone that, like, feels like I live for that, like, where it's like where I can feel you, my mind, my body, and my I can sense you from another continent. That level of an erotic relation with another one, and I've had very few of those in my life. And yeah, it's quite rare, but it's also, I don't even think it's meant to be that rare. I think probably it's not a mode of functioning. People don't want to be completely destabilized in that way. And absolutely, I think part of it is that people are hoping that a relation with another person can do the work you're saying, because recognizing you are the main character, and not just the protagonist like Carrie Bradshaw, like like I'm going to narrate my story life, and this is the heartbreak, and I got a job, and I got a house, and my gosh, my clothes, which I think is, I don't diminish Chicklet, I teach it, because it is not only functional in representing it externalizes internal dynamics, in ways that are legible in everyday language. A lot of things that become like high level, like psychoanalysis, philosophy, I'm always like, these things are happening in everyday life. People are going to use words in big German, and these are everyday sensibilities people have in their grasp. They have all these different narrative structures to fully develop and engage with them. So I can move, Kleinian psychoanalysis, Chicklet, put them together and say, when I say in the classroom, you're going to amplify your senses. It can go from there to there, it can go from physics to, because it's all language that is main character, you needing this thing that can do. And like I said, living in the world, having a place to live, having an ability to social networks and a job, those things matter. There's something functioning in the world. Paying less taxes, feeling a sense of security and safety, feeling a place to rest, those, I'm not diminishing those needs to survive that people can yearn for because they've never had them. It's been an absence for them, in the physical and other things. So it's not to say one over the other.
Could I,
generally speaking,
but I want to do like a role play thing, right? Because for me, what I'm hearing is, what you said, which was so potent, that coming with a list of demands and a list of labels, like predefined labels, or setting your table is not necessarily intimacy, right?
Yeah.
It
feels intimate.
It feels intimate because we think that showing your weaknesses is vulnerability, but I don't think that strategic vulnerability or any sort of strategic interaction is necessarily intimate interaction. And we confuse mindful interaction with strategic interaction and even intentional interaction.
Yes. I think that's spot on, because it seems like I'm disaffected. I was saying earlier about disaffection. Disaffection is most people's standpoint, i.e. you practice what is in the world, and it's really hard work to do with your body to be as disaffected as, I'm not present in my physical environment. That's most of our zero ground of living, functioning. So not being disaffected, it seems disaffected when I'm saying that was not intimate. No, I was present and affected. I'm living in an affective encounter if we did the dialogue, which we're going to do. But it's, in fact, you're scripting the script of vulnerability is a form of disaffection, because it is hard emotional labor to say, this is what I've been through and this is now what I want. It is hard emotional labor, but all of it is affected. But I think when you say mindful, to say, I'm going to be consistent in being present, including telling you something you don't want to hear. And I never thought about it as mindfulness. I just was like, maybe it seems like I'm disaffected and you're busy there suffering emotions. And I'm like, no, that's not intimacy. But it seems rude maybe. But it's true. And it's not like, and I'm also saying it from a place of, it's concerning to me because if no one's going to tell you that you don't know me, then you're going to walk around thinking you know people you don't know. And then you get confused when
they act in ways that you didn't anticipate.
And you keep repeating the pattern, which is what you were saying. So rather than say, my queer group, my heterosexual group, the heterosexuals, I don't want them, to be honest. When I'm around them, it's too much. There's a few that I, try to maintain relations with, but this group, there's too much for my brain to... It's at least here there's some things that can make sense, but the things that are innovative and interesting there, it's too much for my spirit. Maybe I can, when I heal enough, I can hang out there again. But exactly what you were saying, that the expected dialogue or anticipation can only function in certain ways where that is intimacy. If someone says, no, that's not intimacy, it seems like you have no emotional presence. But it's just, no, I'm just mindfully present. And my intention to be mindful is to say, I'm not just dismissing you, I'm saying, I wonder if you've thought about it like this, because this is how I'm thinking about it. And I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not interested in you. And I should be more mindful to say, maybe I'm not interested in you. But I see what I'm saying is, the level of my interest is also based upon the fact that maybe your approach to entering this dialogue is not the same approach as me, and it's made me more cautious to continue to, because I recognize that every time I interact with you, I'm participating in your fantasy, and therefore I become more complicit within it until I make the breaks to say, pause, stay with me, reality, pause, what does connection feel like? Reality, as opposed to fantasy projection that you was, by the time, we all love the dopamine of lying in our beds thinking about someone we met 2 days ago.
Oh yeah.
It's delicious, I get it. I can do it. But I'm like, you're talking about a lifelong commitment to a person you have spent 2 hours with. Pause. That's not just because I want to have no responsibility to your emotions, to say whatever you're doing is irresponsible to yourself. That's what I meant. So thank you for that word. I'm going to use it more. Maybe it seems more like mindful. It's going to be full on take my asshole levels too far. But I was like, I can't do this thing that you described. It doesn't say I went into detail where you spend time committing yourself to a role that people pull you into, that at the end of it is so self-harming that it takes so much work to recover from. And you still end up the asshole.
Do you know what I find so interesting is what you said about heterosexual circles and there being trauma? I feel like you and I are from Zim, right? So for us, up to a certain generation, actually to this day, people can only have generational trauma around heterosexual relationships because queer relationships are not publicly permitted. But the reality of it, though, is that many queer relationships, if we say queerness became open and public in the 90s in South Africa, still have their own trauma, right? In a way, the impact of having been raised in compulsory heterosexuality and then the dynamics that are then reenacted. For me, I've learned a new ambivalence to what people would say the trauma of heterosexuality, because in my own experience, there was also the trauma of queerness, right? And there was the trauma of class that came into play in my queer experience, and how there was so much violence across class lines. Because in the queer community, and maybe this is something you can speak to if you're comfortable, there are certain boundaries and there's certain categories that are seemingly erased until you find yourself in an intimate relationship with another person. And then the reality of us, our own privilege and access and positionality comes into play. And all of a sudden we realize that there is still some fracture. Well, nothing is perfect. And I think what I was saying about being present in each moment, because we're constantly shifting in our relation to others. And so that
sense of being present and aware, and we'll get things wrong. It's also, things that you get wrong, things that you don't observe immediately, things that, that as one kind of, I'm thinking of like being like a young student who's radicalizing their politics and finding other language and people to connect with, and then some mode of perception you had, you numbed because you're entering this one, and then you're like, and then you overdo it. So like I said, lesbiania made me run to that heterosexual marriage because I was like, this thing is real. It's because like actual emotions where you actually enjoy having sex with someone can be really traumatic when you've just been used to lying there, dead stiff, reenacting, self-violence. That you're like, oh my gosh, to be asked to be present. I remember the first time in a long time where I was with a partner who asked me, and I just burst into tears. It was too much to ask, to be fully present in the space. And then I was like, but I only want to have sex with someone where I am fully present, so therefore it limits the options, but it also means I stop numbing myself and exposing myself to harm, because that absence is harmful, right? Mm-hmm. So those are two things holding at once. I think that there's questions of representation. As I said, all these identity things matter. There's contexts of representation that matter, particularly when one is in a category, a minoritized category, so race, class, gender, that always will trigger the question of representation, and particularly around queer politics of visibility, i.e. that those things also operate within the relationship. When I talk about being mingle high school, where you can enter and exit because you have different capacities to enter and exit particular ways of functioning in a system because of how institutionalized you are or are not. And so those questions of power, I think, do demand interrogation, but often the way that they are met are also scripted in a way that don't always allow the discomfort and the distress to sit and then say, let's intuit something else. How do we do accountability? How do we do, is that one language? Are there other languages? Call out has come to an end as a practice for some reason, I guess, because everyone is so tired from post-COVID that it's, so when is it useful and productive to say this is now too much with the person? But when does it also become a kind of, where everybody's like, waiting for their moment to be, in a space of calling out? Because I don't think that those structural relations, they're structural relations, and then they're also interpersonal. They need to find a way to breathe in a space in the room. We're just trying to also survive. And they are parts of how we enter and don't enter being institutionalized that matter, but they also affect the simple thing of what our languages are of love, of intimacy, of care, right? Of, like someone saying, I didn't grow up, in a stable family that looks normative and it's a deep wound for me. And then I meet you. And then now we are in this interaction and you are triggering something that is deep inside me that has nothing to do with you, but you become the protagonist, instead of in the story that's really about myself. Now, what does it look like for me to say, well, I also came to find you because I might have internally something inside myself. Now, if we want to sit together in that distress, and then that could be an option, but to act like it doesn't structurally relate to our life chances, our survival.
I think fantasy is amazing because do you know what it is? If you can feel something, then it is possible to feel. And something that I found where projection becomes a slippery slope is that when we interact with one another, I can feel what you sense about me, just like you can feel what I sense about you. And people forget that we are sensory beings, right? So I will abandon what I created in the emotional interaction that is this moment and leave it as that's on you. And then you now have to work through gaslighting yourself into what you sense.
Into participating.
Yeah, right, into participating, but also into being like, was that actually me? And this happens so often in our relationships. And I wonder if there is something, or if you can unpack what you feel is an element that we can introduce into our relationships. Because what I'm seeing more and more is that there are new types of relationships. There are not just platonic and aplatonic relationships, romantic relationships and friends. I think friends with benefits was a structure from an old time as far as I'm concerned, because it lacks a certain amount of intimacy. For me, you can be yourself, right? But the reality is there's so many different iterations of relationships that are in between on the spectrum, and they don't have to grow into anything else. And I'm wondering if a word or an ideology like open relating is creating possibilities for new types of relationships without all throwing it into the basket of polyamory.
I mean, like I said, me, I'm an infant in this realm because I've just gotten to a place where I was like, don't put me in your projection. Or if I'm going to project with you, we are consensually sitting with this fantasy together. But I'm just at the moment of recognizing, for instance, like I said, the last interaction where the person says, I will not be a people pleaser anymore. And I said, I will not be a people pleaser anymore. Our entry into that conversation looks different. Because again, you put this in the world, I can read your energy, I'm aware of it enough that I do respond to it and I verbalize it. When people don't verbalize things, I'm like, now let me make sense of what you're saying. Maybe I'm perceiving this, is that correct? So when I say, I'm perceiving that you spent some time thinking about this and obsessing about me this way, and I want you to rest yourself. I wasn't thinking about you because I have this number of life things to think about. I'm completely overwhelmed. You're the first person whose phone message I've answered in about 3 weeks. And I'm only responding because I can sense that you are anxious about and you are building a whole main character story about yourself and me. This is the levels of the terrible things happening in my life right now that make it impossible. You are not the main character, but nor is it my lack of interest in you. It is this. Same person who hears, I could be there for you, but I could be there cooking. I'm like, I don't know you enough to be in my private space. Why are you trying to be? But they believe they're being intimate. I can be there. They told me they're not being a pleaser. I'm going to come in your house and tell me to cook and clean and take care of you. Do you not? It's again, different orientation to the question, right? Like all the promise of not being people pleasing, And I'm reading this and I'm like, I want you to understand what you're asking of me. You're asking a relative stranger to invite you into their home so you can take care of them when they've said what they really need is some time alone to process because they have not had time to start grieving their mother who has passed away. Your answer is, let me come take care of you. I'm saying, I'm grieving my mother, even my own child who is here, who has needs that are legitimate from me. I'm having to negotiate space around.
Right.
You are a stranger.
Right.
And so I'm trying to help you to see that picture by giving you access to me that you haven't really earned that intimacy, but I perceive that you are still in a room full of anxiety about rejection. So I'm going to try to give you something to hold on to because I don't want to just be like, that was weird and peace out, right? And instead of hearing me say, I am grieving my mother, I just need a moment and a breath. You are like, but I mean, I like you. From everything from almost nudes being, I'm like, how are you imagining that this is the same conversation we're having?
Can I just pause here for a second? Okay, so, excellent. You speak a lot about linguistic devices. You speak about how language forms our reality. Are there ways that we have taken words for granted and begun to use linguistic devices to actually disguise violence in our human interactions?
Yes, in two ways. I think in one way, when words become useful or sensible, I think it's important to use them in the sense that they're making in that context. So a word's definition may be not its intentional definition, but it's a way to articulate something that's come up in the air that feels, that's got the consciousness of it. But people often will take that word and then repeat it, not only out of the context of where it came up, but it then becomes usable to simply reproduce the same power relations. And I think that there's many words in our political language we can use for that. like emotional intelligence. Watching Love is Blind, people, this Jackie Marshall thing is killing me, but like he said emotional intelligence because he says, I'm a real man. Someone keeps saying I'm a real man. They're having a difficult relationship with that attachment. What is a real man, but also why you're so attached to it that it's enough to justify someone who doesn't want to be with you, and you are the emotionally intelligent one. And what that does, Marshall's example, and my sister and I are like, how is no one thinking this is normal? And I'm like, heteropatriarchy is the ghetto, if this is your ideal. Because someone shouldn't have to keep repeating that to me. I don't even know what that is. And say, I have emotional intelligence. If you have emotional intelligence, the other person should be able to perceive that without you expressing it. And so the fact that you can describe emotions does not mean emotional intelligence. It means being able to perceive another person and recognize them. So when he says, I saw you as a project, that is foolishness. That is a sign of someone who performs a kind of sensitivity in the public. That means that when that person says this person is harming me, they seem like they're crazy. These nice guy tropes, I've been there, done that, wrote the book, memoir, self-help, I could do it myself. I.e., that's picking up on a vocabulary in the public. Many things come in the public. They have something useful to do. They cohere a sense of meaning that we think we all know. They become nonsensical because describing your emotions is not emotional intelligence. Being able to perceive and engage another person and then say, you seem uncomfortable, you seem overwhelmed, and then saying, I recognize that I'm going to serve you. Not the same. So I think those are, and in particular, violent relationships often operate with that veneer of a language that looks possible, utopian, beautiful, but in fact, they do this masking of continuing, and often then continuing what becomes physical, but also emotional, financial, other kinds of violence. And those violences, incidentally, are so normal in the everyday, because we live in environments of slow violence. People like toxic masculinity, and then you repeat. It's almost become devoid of meaning. It's just another acronym for black men. How did we get there? We live in an environment that's built by a system of the father that is white, capitalist, heteropatriarchy. How do we get to a single individual is the embodiment of this term, to the point where people breathe it without ever sitting. Sit with what is in the present.
Right.
Breathe with what is in the present.
Right.
Before you give it a frame or name that becomes nonsensical. We're talking about no roads, no transport, only a state providing prisons and psychiatric hospitals. What are you imagining is the condition of violence in that context that makes the embodiment of it a young black man?
I have to speak against that. Because if we have to unmask white male violence and what it creates and has recreated, and the system of intelligent violences it has created, it is frightening. And it is frightening because it's a violence that has then managed to project on an absolute other, which is the black man, while also projecting on the black woman, while also projecting on the brown woman, the Asian woman and man, and white women, right? White male violence is a frightening system. White males aren't necessarily frightening, but the violence is.
Well, some of them certainly can be, because they're doing a lot of mass murdering.
But if we had to step back from that and we have to speak to you as this embodied person that you are, what is your signature that you want to leave behind? We've spoken about language, we've spoken about relationships, intimacy, the moment of consciousness, the limitations of incarnation and justice. If you had to see yourself as a ray, an intelligence on your own, and you had to contribute to a protopian vision of the future, so where we work towards transformation, what would you say you are leaving, or what would you say you are writing into the record of time?
I think I just like to leave more poetry in the everyday, things to be beautiful, not because they are, not like, the sunflower and daffodil, but things to, like, not an aesthetic beauty, but a sensuous beauty. So it's also in language, but it's like the body's language. It's like the ground, it's like growing food, it's like, so things that, but also that the meaning continuously is unfolded, like there's layers and layers of meanings. I think just a breath to say, so that it's not about productivity, even though like feeding each other can be productive, but it's not, I feed you so you can work you know, it's a different kind of, so I would imagine more poetry and presence in that kind of, like doing this, like, what do you call it when something has layers and layers and layers and layers, but there's no lines and,
So what I see in you is your sensitive soul. And it's so beautiful. It's beautiful because you are able to be present with everything. And you are reflective with everything. I don't think it's just an experience or a human being. I think it's everything around you that you are present and reflective with. So I want to thank you for coming here and showing the sensitivity of your soul and creating that sound, you know, and writing that into time. Because someone else with a sensitive soul is going to see this and see that they're exactly what they need to be. And that this genius is available to everyone, because now it is available in our Akasha. So thank you so much.